thanks for coming. A lot of you have just attended, obviously, the International Behavioural Public Policy Conference, and therefore I'm guessing that your brains are pretty scrambled right now, as are mine. So this is one of the occasions where I'm going to have to refer to a few notes to begin with. My name's Adam Oliver. I'm a Professor of Behavioural Public Policy at the LSE. 3 years ago, I think 3 years ago now, was the first conference for the International Behavioural Public Policy Association. That was held at the LSE. Many of you, I think, attended that, or some of you attended that. And if you remember, at the end of that conference, which was hosted by the LSE, we had a closing panel and reception at King's College. So this was to reciprocate, essentially, right? So this year we're going to have the closing panel, obviously, here at the LSE. Right? So welcome to the LSE. I want to just thank, very sincerely, Frontier Economics, because they're one of the great consultancies based in London, and they're sponsoring this event today. And they've been supporters of the conference in the past as well. So anybody from Frontier here, thank you very much. On that note, one of our speakers today was supposed to be Lord Gus O'Donnell. He used to be the head of the British Civil Service, but he was also the chair of Frontier Economics. So Gus essentially, I think those that work for Frontier, they can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he's just stepped down from being the chair of Frontier Economics, but he still has an association with them. And Gus was my link, basically, to Frontier Economics. He's been called away for House of Lords business tonight. He's in the House of Lords and he's on business. So unfortunately, Gus can't be here. But he has got a connection to the LSE also. He's a visiting professor at the LSE. And on that note, tonight's panel, I chose these particular esteemed colleagues because they all, in some way, have an association with the LSE. And I thought, since we're hosting the final panel at the LSE, it would be nice to have people that are associated with the LSE to speak to you today. So before I just tell you what their brief was, I'll just brief you on who they are, although I think you know most of them here. Immediately to my left here is Matteo Galizzi. Matteo is, I think, one of the real prominent players in behavioural science and behavioural public policy. He's an associate professor in the Psychology and Behavioural Science department. He kind of runs the executive program in behavioural science at the LSE also. So it's great to have Matteo here. Heather Kappes. Heather has also been a very long-standing, very important member of the behavioural science community. Heather's specialism is in marketing, and she's based in she's an associate professor in the management department at the LSE. Zeina Afif, who many of you know also. Zeina is also been, let me just say that they've all been tremendous contributors, right? And then I don't have to say individually to behavioural public policy. Zeina is one of the behavioural leads at the World Bank. She's been very, very important in terms of our connection to the policy world. And Zeina is a senior visiting professor in the Department of Psychology and Behavioural Science at the LSE. Liz Costa, many of you heard her the other night. She has been one of the leaders for many, many years of the Behavioural Insights team. As you all know, one of the most important behavioural agencies and consultancies in the world. Liz is also a senior visiting professor in PBS has stolen everybody, right? I'm in social policy, I'm not in PBS, but she's in PBS also. And then Luke at the end there, Luke Bovens. Luke was a professor of philosophy at the LSE for many years, and he's been a very great colleague of mine since I first met him probably 20 years ago. He also was the lead organizer of the second iteration of the conference, actually, the Behavioural Public Policy Conference, which was held at the University of North Carolina, which is that's now his full-time position. He's a professor of philosophy at UNC. But as I said, I like to still think of Luke as very much an LSE person as well. Okay, so that's our panelists tonight. They're brief. They're each going to speak for 10 minutes, or maximum of 10 minutes. So they're going to speak briefly. And the task I gave them, really, I said to them all, imagine that behavioural public policy had never been invented as a field, right? how would you like to see behavioural public policy develop, given that blank slate? I hope that makes sense. I hope it made sense to you when I asked you all to do that. So that's their brief. They're going to do that, 10 minutes each, as I said, maximum. Then we're going to open it up to discussion, so you can all contribute then, if you want. And then at 7:30, there's going to be a reception just outside this room, actually, in that foyer that you see, so you can have a well-earned glass of wine and some LSE nibbles or something like that. Okay, I think that's everything that I wanted to say right now, looking at my notes, because I can't remember anything at the moment. Yeah, I think that's everything. So, I'm going to go. I didn't really have an order of people that in mind, really, but I see that there's three females and 2 males, so I'm going to go female, male, etc. So, first up, Heather, okay. You're on.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm honored to be part of this group. You gave us this brief a couple months ago, so in the time since that I've been thinking about it, I feel like I've gone on kind of an intellectual journey, and it's definitely continued over the 3 days of this conference. So I just wanted to share with you a little bit like what I thought I was going to say tonight if you would have asked me a couple days ago, and then why I've changed my mind. And what I'm going to come around to basically is that if I was redesigning or designing the field of behavioral public policy from a blank slate, I wouldn't really suggest anything different than how the field has emerged in the last 15 years. And it's not to say that I think the field is perfect, that it can't get better, that it won't get better in the coming years. But it's to say that basically everything I came up with, I think, created its own new set of problems that might lead us to be worse off than we are today. And also that I've come to have kind of a renewed appreciation for the strengths of what we've learned and where we've gotten to in these 15 years. So basically, when someone asks you to kind of redesign or to design a field of study, right, for me the implication was design it in a way where we would be in a better place now. So for behavioral public policy, what does that mean? I guess it means probably that we would have changed behavior more. We would have achieved more impact on policy or on policy goals. You know, people would be more responsibly using credit, more eating healthier, basically just more change faster. So what I was inclined to suggest, right, was that we would want to design this field in a way where it would touch more stages of the policy life cycle. So more of a role in agenda setting, in designing legislation and getting that legislation passed, rather than mainly on the later stages of the policy life cycle, which is mainly how things are implemented and how they're evaluated. And I wanted to say that, I was kind of inspired to say that based on the year and a half that I was connected to the Office of Evaluation Sciences, which is part of the United States General Services Administration. And just to be clear, right, I'm not affiliated there anymore. I'm not speaking officially, and other people there might very well disagree. But what I found when I was there was that the way that the group operated was looking for changes that were feasible for them to implement without needing like a lot of really high-level complicated authorizations or changing legislation. So what that meant in practice is that these amazing talented people that I was working with usually ended up tweaking some kind of communication. So they were doing letters, emails, pop-ups, and often they were building in what we have learned from research in the behavioral sciences. So they were making communications about social norms or loss aversion or pre-commitments or other kinds of tweaks that we think should make things better. But at the end of the day, what we found was years and projects of really small or null effects that feels pretty disappointing, right? And even these kind of projects in themselves feel kind of disappointing because probably like a lot of you, I was coming to that work from this nudge idea of feeling really inspired, like we can achieve big change potentially by tweaking the decision environment. But it turns out that a lot of changes to a decision environment that you might make would require kind of high-level approval or changing legislation. And because we weren't set up in a way where we could or would do that, we ended up doing other things instead. I'm reminded of this interview that I did, right? So this was discovery research when we were starting to work on payment integrity and improper payments. And I was talking to someone who worked on payment integrity at a particular government agency. And we had the idea that along with other questions, we would ask this kind of blue sky thinking question, which we thought might give us some ideas for new behavioral interventions we could test. So we said something like, if you could change the behavior of one group of people in a way that would reduce the problem of improper payments, what would that be? And this person said, I would have Congress rewrite the legislation so that our issues that are classified right now as improper payments wouldn't be. So that wasn't the kind of answer that I was like hoping to get, right? But it's a genuine, honest answer, and it kind of stuck with me because it was really like, yeah, well, I mean, whether or not that's a good idea, it would have a much bigger impact on improper payment rates than anything that we are probably going to be able to implement. So that's where I was coming at up until a few days ago. But I kept thinking about this, and I've heard more about the work that people in this field are doing over the last few days. And so basically what I want to say now is that I'm not inclined to suggest that I would have designed this field in a way where behavioral public policy academics and practitioners would be playing a bigger role in these early stages of the policy life cycle. Why not? Well, one reason is that hearing about the work that people are doing, there's actually a lot more of that already happening than I knew about. So we've heard about really interesting ways that people are being embedded in agencies, helping to craft and advise and give insight on different policies. And so, you know, maybe it's taken 8 or 10 years to get there, but it feels like the field is there and it's heading in directions where that approach might even be growing. But, you know, despite recognizing and really being impressed with and excited by a lot of that work, I'm also not going to say that I think the field should have been designed in a way where we would be doing maybe even more of that. And there's a couple reasons that I'll share with you. One of them is I think if we, as behavioral public policy researchers, we're playing a bigger role there, it would require becoming more political in ways that I think might hurt the field. Because if you're setting an agenda, you're designing legislation, you're lobbying for this legislation to be passed, you're probably going to end up being aligned with either specific politicians or political parties in ways that might make that work not really sustainable when the political winds change. And I think it's actually interesting to see that we're in a relatively strong state right now of, at least as far as I see it, not being too much associated with any political party in a way that I think has probably meant the field is more sustainable. The second reason is that, and this is probably somewhat controversial. I think Faisal had some really interesting comments, so he might disagree with me in the last panel that we just attended. But for me, I realized that if we were playing a bigger role in these early stages, we would have to be putting ourselves on the line more to say, what is a desirable outcome? What should people actually be doing? So, you know, should they be taking high interest short-term loans? I might think that most people should not be, but there might be good arguments for people to say, actually, I should, and I want to have this option available to me. Now, the way that the Office of Evaluation Sciences operated was it was actually kind of funny. So there was this common misconception that people in government would think OES stood for Office of Evaluation Services, because really it operated kind of like a service model, right? Like they could come to you, they could ask, can we hire you to help with our issue? And the nice part of that was that, first of all, people in the group were free to kind of, you know, say, oh, we don't have the capacity to take on certain projects that people weren't excited about working on, and to go after and to try to bring in other ones that people were more aligned with. But it also meant that you had this kind of luxury of not having to define what's the behavior that people should be doing, because the government agencies have already set that as a policy goal. So it lets us have a little bit the luxury, and maybe this is a shortcoming, some of you guys would probably disagree, but of saying, you know, we're researchers, we really want to know what happens, right? What's the evidence? We don't have skin in the game in terms of wanting to sell this or that policy. It kind of leaves the policy outcomes closer to the realm of people who are democratically elected rather than people who have been kind of hired behind the scenes to work on this. And then the third reason why I basically came around to, like, I don't want to suggest this slate of changes, is that I think if we look at these 15 years that this field has existed, we actually have learned a lot. So, you know, as disappointing as these kind of communication interventions and all of these different slate of research is, I think one like key lesson that I've learned is that it's a lot harder to achieve big behavioral change than we might have thought, right? So people that I worked with, right, I think we all had kind of implicitly this idea that I've got a PhD. I should be able to write a better letter than the government is sending out right now, right? But you get to talk to these kind of frontline bureaucrats, people who were working on these policy issues, and often they actually have a pretty good understanding of what works and what doesn't work, what are the challenges. There are often genuine reasons why things look the way that they look and what you can actually implement. And so if there's anything that I think I've learned from these 15 years of this field, it's really to be a little bit more humble about our power to achieve big behavioral change. And kind of with that spirit of being humble, I guess I would say I don't think I can really design the field from scratch in a way that I'm confident would leave us in a better place now than where we are. I feel excited about where we are right now. I'm sure other people who are speaking will have great ideas about improvements we can make in the future to keep the field moving in a great direction. But that's where I ended with my answer.
Great, thanks, Heather. We're going to have all the speakers and then we'll open it up. So I'm going to pass on immediately to Matteo.
Okay. Thank you, Adam. Thank you for organizing this panel. Thank you all for being here. And I think it's a great honor to be here, and also to, first of all, to celebrate BPP as a field. It's 15 years. It's fair to say that it was set up in the Department of Social Policy at LSE, which is hosting the event. At that time, I was a postdoc helping to set up the Behavioural Lab, and Adam's office was just around the corner from the open office I was working on. And I remember it was organizing at the time the first seminar series on behavioral public policy, where he was bringing in some of the scholars to the LSE very often for the first time. I remember Elke Weber, George Lowenstein, Graham Blooms, and they were the first time they were coming to the LSE. So from that moment, clearly, the field has evolved a lot. The conference in King's College organized by Sunshine and colleagues is testament that there is now a community, a global community, which is really exciting, young, vibrant, and is something that we should be very grateful and to have set up. Having said that, I'm also very humble in believing that there is nothing as I would have done differently. Perhaps there are three things that I would like to see more in the behavioral public policy field in the next years to come, and I agree on this one with Heather. The first one is looking at the sessions as well in the conference, and also looking back to the articles published in the PP journal. Clearly, most of the behavioral public policy analysis at the moment is on the side of society, which is kind of assumed in behavioral economics to be less informed, less experienced in a sense, typically the consumers, the patients, the citizens. And paradoxically, because the field is called behavioral public policy, there is much less that we know about the other side of the society. So on the professional decision making, the expert decision making, the advisors, the financial decision maker, the policy makers, the civil servants, the doctors. Of course, in these dyads, doctors, patient, the citizen, the policymaker, there is always the idea that is the citizen, is the patient, the one that is more prey to errors, to bias, to mistakes, the one that needs to be guided to better decision, right? But a lot of work by some of the people in this room, Gigerenzen, suggests that doctors, physicians, policymakers are human beings too. So they do make errors, they do make biased decisions, they do very poor decisions as well. And that aspect, I think, is a bit underexplored at the moment. I was really excited by seeing a session today, this morning, with Matteo, with Zia, or about policymakers, civil servants, and who is doing policy making and decision making. And similarly, I think, is is an area where we should probably know a bit more, is about the decision-making processes itself in the organization, in the public sector, in the government, but also in the companies. In large organizations, there is quite clear from the many of us that have helped advising during the pandemic responses in governments, in public health agencies, that the way the advisor, the scientific advisor, interact with policymakers, or the way the policymaker the decisions are made, are far from being optimal. The different ways where scientists and researchers interact among themselves before being brought into an emergency, and with the policymaker, was not always designed in a very intelligent way behaviorally. And it would be nice to have a new stream of work in BPP where we are looking at how we can design more behavioral intelligent decision processes in organization, in policy decision making. An area that I find very exciting by now is to help this type of policy decision making with decision aids, or with AI tools, with LLMs, to help them to make better decisions. The second area, and I think it's slightly related to that one, is that is clearly, and I agree with Sanchayan on the conclusion in the last panel in King's College, is very clear that now we are seeing in the conference, in an annual conference in BPP, a bit less about nudges. Okay, we are seeing more about behavioral intervention, not just nudges. I don't have anything against nudging, although I would like to see a bit more about nudging the nudgers, for the reason that I just mentioned, for instance, intervention targeting the key decision making. But also it's good that we are getting a more open-minded, a more pluralistic view to behavioral intervention, not just nudges, but the wonderful tools designed by Sanchayan, by Peter John, Nudge Plus, the Boost, all the behavioral intervention, the budgets, and of course, I'm also coming to you, Anna, of course. But also, I will even, apart from this type of classical tools, now classical tools in the behavioral science and policy toolkit, but also I will venture to say that I would like to see more about the traditional policy tools. Alongside the nudges, alongside the boost, alongside the nudge plus, I would like to see more systematic tests, for instance, of the classical tools, taxes, subsidies, incentives, mandates, information, education. Those things, actually, we know they work. Think about externalities. To what extent they do better than other behavioral intervention? I think here there is clearly a gap in the generation of evidence, testing systematically in large-scale tests, experimental tests, those behavioral interventions that I mentioned, alongside more structural policy tools. And I think that will also make sense to come up with more creative, more structural, more long-term solution, to some extent in our community, to some of the challenges that are affecting our society, our world. In a chaotic, a very uncertainty world, maybe we need to be testing things with an open eye, an open mind, and looking at all the law set. The last point, and is an old, on this one I realize that I'm a broken record sometimes. I would like to see even more engagement with open, reproducible, and transparent research in behavioral public policy. Don't get me wrong, I think the field is doing well, is doing very well, clearly is a field which is highly engaging with RCTs, experiments of any sort, online lab field experiments, very strong methods, very strong rigorous analysis, and also if you look at the articles that are published in the journal, they very often engage with registration, sharing data, sharing material. So there is actually, I would even venture to say that compared to other fields of other discipline, neighboring discipline, the BPP field is quite good in those things. However, there is the discussion, for instance, today suggests that there are lots of other method that we should continue to develop. There are the discussion about bridge, DAGs, GAMS, those integration of RCT with augmented methods, or the discussion about the equivalent testing, the discussion about testing things with synthetic participants as well. Those are new methods that should be part of the new toolkit, methodological toolkit of the behavioral public policy research as now a field experiment, online experiment, and behavioral mapping as well, behavioral diagnostic. All those things should come into fruition, I think. And I think from this perspective, I would say, and I conclude, that one area that is still missing, though, and it was touched in several occasions during the conference, including the final panel, is that we are still missing a large-scale collaborative endeavor. And I know that I have already discussed this one with Adam, with Liz, with Zeina, with Heather, many other times. But it looks like we are still relying on a lot of relatively small-scale RCTs, if you want, or studies, while we could potentially make upscale the game a bit and promoting a large-scale collaboration between different teams of policymakers, different teams of researchers all over the world, testing potentially the same systematically test all over the world in different settings of different behavior intervention, and then finally sharing the results, sharing the data, sharing lessons all over the world. What I would like to see is a collaboration of scale of ambition like the Cochrane collaboration in medicine. Okay, is something similar. It's something that repeatedly come up. Okay, how do I know what is working and in which context exactly? Okay, it is ambitious, I think, but there is no better place to make this happening than the BPP community, and that can be the platform for that to happen. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Matteo. Zeina, you're next.
Well, first, I just want to start by saying how surreal this is that I'm sitting here with my professors from 10 years ago when I was doing the master's at LSE. So it's a huge privilege to be here, and I'm really listening to you guys very eagerly to see also how much things have changed since I took the course, the master's 10 years ago. So my reflections come from my own journey in behavioral science, working at the World Bank for the past 10 years. Mostly focusing on development. But I want to just start by saying that regardless how much criticism we have about nudging and its limitation and the issues with generalizability, we wouldn't be even having this conversation if it wasn't for nudge. So we have to give credit where credit is due. If it wasn't for the book Nudge, Cass Sunstein, Richard Taylor, David Halpern setting up the BIT, we would not be here. I would not be here. So that's one thing important to acknowledge. And what the biggest contribution is, other than the wealth of insights, is the simplicity of the selling of behavioral science, the simple story of what behavioral science can do. And maybe it was over-promising a bit, but that basically allowed policymakers to be interested and want to hear more about behavioral science, and opened up the door for many of us here. So I'm not sure I would be creating it from scratch, but my experience in behavioral science, starting off from nudging, was when I started working at the World Bank, the first thing I realized is people were not just interested in solutions and nudges. And I think that's the first thing I would think about changing is behavioral science, when it started off, it was mostly about solutions, nudges. This is what you can do. What we found ourselves at the World Bank, we were very eager to basically replicate a lot of these interventions. What we find is World Bank team coming to us asking, how do I fix, and I'm sorry for those who heard this again, how do I fix gender-based violence in Bangladesh? How do I bring social cohesion in Iraq? How do I get families to use shelters in Haiti? They were coming to us with extremely complex issues where standard tools were not solving the problems. And we never said we can solve them, but what we did say, we can try to understand why they are not working and what can be done. So this is where the whole behavioral diagnostic work, which makes 80% of our work, came in. We do a lot of RCTs, around 55%, but a lot of our work is around behavioral diagnostics to help policymakers understand why standard policy tools are not leading to the results they expect them to get. Second to that is The second kind of thing to keep in mind is a lot of the countries in development don't have the advanced infrastructure where behavioral science was being rolled out in Europe. One of the first projects I worked on, we worked so hard to design an intervention to encourage beneficiaries of a cash transfer, female beneficiaries of a cash transfer, to basically get them into the labor market. We trained the social workers. We were ready to go to the field. They started calling the beneficiaries. Most of the numbers did not work. So here goes our RCT design. Our sample became very small because the phone numbers did not work, and then now we had to think, how do we actually get numbers? But what that led is, even though we didn't get an RCT, but we had an intervention, they realized how important it was to make sure their phone number, they had correct addresses and phone numbers of all of their beneficiaries. So that was, for me, a positive result, spillover of the actual intervention. So that's something to also keep in mind. But in addition to infrastructure, we've realized that a lot of the issues we're dealing with are so complex that you need to talk about social norms. So even if you can tweak, you can basically address some of the biases or use heuristics, at the end of the day, if you don't deal with the bigger forces such as social norms and mental models, how people view themselves, their identities, if you don't deal with this, you're not going to really have sustainable change. And that's something that became very, very obvious for us through our work, that we had to start understanding what is social norms, how do you measure them, how do you unpack them. Same thing with mental models. How do you tackle aspiration? How do you tackle social identities, especially if you're talking about social cohesion? So now to the next point is, as I'm continuing my journey, realize a lot of the work we actually are doing is kind of debiasing the policymakers, because they are coming with a lot of assumption about what needs to happen. And until we've done these behavioral diagnostics, and a lot of them, we took them along the research we were doing, the field research, they for themselves are realizing, about their own assumptions. And because of that, they were able to start designing, hopefully, better policies. So a lot of times we do these diagnostics. I'll give an example. In one country, they wanted to get, water utility wanted to get the consumers to pay their water bill. So they're like, let's do SMS messages, replicating all of the other IDs for you to intervention. So we said, we can do that, but can we just spend a little bit more time understanding why people are not paying their water bill? Well, guess what? We did that diagnostic. It was very hard to pay your bill. You had to travel to go to another city, to go to a lottery house, wait in line, and it's not that much. It's not that much money that is worth it. So for a lot of people, it was too much of a hassle to actually pay their bill. It was difficult. And what does that mean? It wasn't that we had to change the messages. The utility company had to change the way it actually was communicating, providing options for people to pay their bills if they don't have online banking. And then another thing that we discovered is, we are really dealing in policy making, public policy is dealing with uncertainty. There's so much changing. You can come and design the great program. As you are implementing, the environment has changed, especially when we're going development and fragile context as well, in conflict context. And if you think of where you are right now with the unsettled global political economy times, it's so hard to kind of plan interventions and implement them. So you have to be not just humble, but you have to be able to adapt, to be able to iterate and adapt and make changes. And that was something that we felt was important for policymakers to also gain from behavioral science, is how do you continue, iterate, and get feedback loop to be able to navigate a lot of the uncertainty. So, so I talked about the importance of diagnostics, about systems, about norms, mental models, policymakers, uncertainty. And as I'm doing this whole journey, I realized I had just talked about the World Bank Development Report 2015, which was on mind, behavior, and society, and that was not what I was planning to do. But my whole journey took me back to say that I was not involved in the report, whoever wrote that report really understood public policy, really understood development, and what would be needed to be able to address them. But one last point I'll make is that what I described as messy, complex, time-consuming work, that if we had proposed that, it would have been dead on arrival. So I'm very grateful for Nudge and its brilliance and what's been able to do for us for the field. And I can't wait to see how all of our experiences collectively is helping develop the field.
Thanks, Zeina. That's great. Luke.
Yeah, thanks very much, Adam, for this invitation. It's a little bit of a challenge, coming from a philosophy department and then being asked to single-handedly, redesign behavioral public policy. But I'm going to try to bring some voices from America and give a voice to Maya Shankar and the people of Flint, the people of Flint, Michigan. And I hope there'll be a little bit of an insight in that. Where do I want to start? I'm thinking about trust. Yeah, trust in government, trust in public health officials, and so on. What's been happening over the last 20 years is just, massive drop in trust. When you'd ask the people being surveyed, whether you could trust the government most of the time. People said in 2000, about 50% of people said yes. Now it's about 20% of the people. So you just have this, massive drop in trust in government and in public health officials. And then I'm thinking, well, behavioral public policy over the last 20 years on the rise, right? Now, of course, I've been long enough in the LSE to know that, correlation is not causation, okay? Fair enough. But still, I sort of want to think a little bit, about the question, did we do that, right? Cause that drop in trust. And in a way, it seems a little bit unfair because, that's one of the things that we study is trust, right? But anyway, let me start with a Washington Post study that came out about 2 years ago. They looked at two neighboring counties, one in Ohio, one in New York, pretty much the same history, but quite a different life expectancy. And the county in Ohio had a substantially lower life expectancy than the county in New York. And the question was, why is that the case, right? And two important factors here were cigarette taxes. Cigarette taxes were lower in Ohio. Ohio is, Republican-controlled. New York is Democrat-controlled. Cigarette taxes were lower in Ohio. And enforcement of seatbelt laws was much lower in Ohio. And these two things is already, big time explanation of what's going on. Now, of course, what's going on here, it's kind of strange, right? You got conservatives who are very much going by Mill's harm principle. That's harm to self. You shouldn't be regulating this, right? But that is, I think, part of the spirit. And this whole trust issue, is very much caught in polarization. Yeah? The lowest trust we find in the GOP, the lowest trust we find among people who have only a high school degree, if you compare them to people who have a BA. Yeah? So that's an educational polarization. The lowest trust we find in people who identify as conservatives, rural communities and so on. So, this is very much part of the polarization game. So now I'm thinking, let's push this a little bit further to nudge, yeah, sort of go to behavioral public policy in nudge style, yeah. And I think, one of the things that is sort of a general characterization here is, well, you target a behavioral change in a particular way that is different from tapping into the actual reasons why people should change their behavior. You find some sort of clever way to get them to change their behavior without really tapping into the actual reasons why they should change their behavior. And if you think of that, and there's been some interesting studies since the election of Trump about, what does the working class stand for? How are there really these differences in values and so on? And one of the things that pops up immediately is the straight talk stuff, The working class wants straight talk, yeah? Alfred Lebrano, in limbo had this quote from a person he interviewed, and it's a working class person, and he said, look, if you got a problem, if you want something from me, come and talk to me. I don't like your two-faced games. Yeah? And this idea of getting people to change their behavior by pushing a button, which is really not about the actual reasons why they should change their behavior, I think you just fall straight into two-faced behavior. Okay? So now let's bring in some Maya Shankar here. So Maya Shankar founded and was in charge of the behavioral science unit under Obama. And towards the end of her tenure, because it doesn't exist anymore, she goes to Flint, Michigan, because they want to do something about the water crisis, right? Talks to people there, and there's an article in The Atlantic which, sort of talks about her experience. And I'm just going to give you a quote. Palmer is one of the people that they interview in Flint, Michigan, asked why I'd come to Flint. I is Maya Shankar. And she says, I'm following this behavioral sciences team from the White House. They're trying to figure out how to use insights about real human behavior to do a better job with public policy. Stuff like the water crisis here. They looked at each other, the good people of Flint, and said, oh, you mean like brainwashing? Yeah? Okay. Well, I guess they'd probably call it more like applying research aimed to make policies better and cheaper and more effective. I searched for an example, says Maya. Like, instead of just telling veterans that they're eligible for certain benefits, they told them they had earned those benefits. And suddenly, lots of them tried to enroll. What do the good people of Flint say? Yeah, brainwashing, right? So you get this thing, this is two-faced behavior that I'm getting from you, right? And then towards the end of the article, she ends on a positive note, and it's a curious story actually. Again, I'm going to give you the quote. Shankar called Kent Key in Flint, and he mentioned his idea of one of the inhabitants in Flint for a program to help the city's youth to take a more proactive role in the water crisis. The city's youth, okay? Perhaps the research could be applied there, he says to Maya Shankar, okay? These were the faintest beginnings of what Shankar had long imagined, a process that took behavioral interventions beyond the nudge and made bureaucracies capable of listening as much as prescribing. And that's how the article ends, a great piece in The Atlantic. And, what's that all about, right? Well, I think it's sort of the wisdom of, nothing about us without us, okay? It's the wisdom of you always have to involve your stakeholders, otherwise things don't work. We heard about the citizens panels in this meeting, that's sort of going in that direction. But it seems like the wisdom of this article is very much like, don't try to look down from the top and find some clever ways, because it's gonna increase the distrust. It's two-faced and this and that. If you can't engage the people somehow in your process, then things aren't gonna go anywhere. And that's Voices from America, I guess. No, it's an interesting article. Check it out, the Maya Shankar piece in The Atlantic, and that's my little contribution here.
Okay, so if you remember from Tuesday evening, Liz kicked off the conference really, and now she's going to end it. It seems fitting for you to almost end the conference. Right?
Yeah, that's right. 3 days, was it that 3 days ago? It's been a big week.
Liz.
Thanks, Adam, and thank you to you and all of the conference organisers for putting on a great week. I think we're all sitting here synthesising a huge amount of new information from the week. And it's a tough gig going last on this panel, actually, because I think there's been so many great insights already about how the field's evolved and also what we might do differently, what we might do the same. So I might try and focus my comments on points that haven't already been made by the panel. But the thing I want to say first is that I think as a field, behavioural public policy has had an enormous impact over the past 15 years. And it's also been hugely flexible and adaptive over that time and evolved a lot. So I think we have done a pretty good job. But having said that, I think there's things that if I was starting again, I would probably do differently. And I want to categorise those into questions about where, how, and what we do as a field. So firstly, where, thinking about it in a very practical sense, I think perhaps slightly differently to Heather, I probably would change where behavioural teams sit within institutions. And if I was starting again, I would seek to much more closely integrate behavioural teams into strategy and policy teams within institutions, within governments. There's a couple of reasons for that. I think firstly, having the behavioural teams as distinct and discrete means that some of the challenges we've had over the past decade in particular is that those teams are often not at the centre of conversations and not at the start of conversations, and they can they can struggle with being a bit on the periphery of things, and I think that's not always helpful, or it's often not helpful, and it really comes down to the individuals in those teams rather than actually the structures of the organisation supporting behavioural science and behavioural thinking being integrated from the very beginning of a policy development. And I think it also kind of locks into some of the comments that have been made about what Richard Thaler would call permission bias of, we end up having to fight and advocate for doing ambitious things, whereas I think if behavioural teams were much more integrated into policy and strategy functions, that, we'd still have issues with permission bias, but I think that they would be less than they are at the moment. And I also think we could have done more to have them not be discrete, but actually have behavioural science and all the methods that sit with it just be part of the expectations of any good policy analyst. That actually, this is how good policy is done, this is the baseline expectation, and this is how we think, is one of the ways we think through policy problems. So secondly, on where we do it, I would seek to be much more international much earlier. And as my colleague Laura said, we would have gone to France much earlier if we'd started again. But genuinely, I think we're at a point in the field where it's so fantastic, the vibrancy of the field that comes from the work that's being done around the world by Zeina and her team, by many of you in the room. And, a lot of the core foundational research of behavioural public policy was done in weird contexts. And I think a lot of the early studies tended to be replications of things that had been done in weird countries. And I think what we're getting to now, which is fantastic, is really a bi-directional influence of, the work that Russia and her team are doing in the UAE is cutting edge, it's fantastic, it's something that everyone around the world can take and learn from. And I think that vibrancy, that international community and the reciprocity that we're seeing now, I think it's fantastic we're getting there, but we could have got there sooner, I think. So secondly, on the how we do things, I wholeheartedly agree with Matteo on the methods, so I'm not going to comment more on that rather than to say 100%. I think as a field, we love a definitional argument, and I personally do not. I think it doesn't really move us forward particularly, and so if we started again, I would encourage everyone to, I guess, hold on to their particular camp of behavioural public policy a little more lightly, because these issues, they are important, but actually when you get into policy making is messy, it's cross-cutting, it's pragmatic, and it's less about is this a nudge or is it a boost. It's more about actually what is going to work in this context and what is the best toolkit that we can bring to bear on this problem. So I think I would encourage us all to come into it with more of that mindset. Similarly, I think on the false distinction between systematic interventions and individual interventions, I think we could have done a lot more about actually what's the connective tissue between those two things. Because if you want to change a system, you need to understand what's happening at the individual level, and you need to change that as well. If you want to change individual behaviour, you need to understand what the systemic influences of it are. And often, if you want to do either well, you need to operate at the micro and the macro levels and be able to bring this all together. And that's a really hard thing to do. And I think the binary thinking of, is this an individual behaviour change challenge or is this a systems challenge, kind of leads us down the wrong path a lot of the time. And I can see heads nodding, so maybe we can pick that up in the discussion. And then finally, I think I've been thinking a lot more recently about not just how we help people make better decisions, but how we build the skills and capabilities of people to be better decision makers. And I think, again, I totally agree with Zeina on the simplicity of the nudge narrative. And to me, these things are on a spectrum of do you change choice architecture and the context in which people are making a decision, or do you build people's skills and capability? But I think that actually over the past decade, we've probably done more of the changing the context and the environment of a decision, and not enough of the building the skills and capabilities in people to be better decision makers in lots of different aspects of their lives, with or without an intervention to support them. So I'll leave it there, but
Thank you very much.
yeah.
Okay, I think we've got. Thanks for all for keeping in time as well. That's great. So. We still have more work to do yet. Yeah, we're going to sort of have discussion across the room now. We wanted to create quite a bit of time for that, or leave quite a bit of time for that. I think there's roving mics. Is there roving mics? There's roving mics. So if you just want to put your hand up, unlike main conference, I'm going to ask you to say who you are, because not everybody knows who everybody is. So say who you are and where you're from. No, you don't have to give a full biography. Right?
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Addie, and I am from Duke University. Sorry, Dr. Bovens. This is actually a question, this is for any of you, but it is kind of related to what you were talking about. So I got my undergraduate degree in cultural anthropology, and when I told my former advisor from undergraduate that I was in behavioral science now, he kind of made this comment about like, behavioral science, like this is where, if the field of cultural anthropology had been a little bit more innovative and applied, this might have been where we ended up in like this applied space. And it makes me think a lot, because I think now that I've had experience in both fields, sometimes I do feel as though we are lacking in behavioral science the core assumption of anthropology, that everyone's behaviors and views of the world is entirely informed by the culture that they came up in. And I'm just curious about like what you think about the future of, I think Dr. Bovens especially, to your points of like bringing in considerations of the cultures that people are existing in as we're thinking about the barriers to them making good decisions. Thank you.
Okay, Luke, you've been identified, so I think.
I'm on the spot here, right? Yeah, I mean, I think especially sort of thinking about this international context and so on, that's where it becomes even more important to listen to people and not to have your interventions coming from above, right? It's a bit of an oddity point, the Nigerian writer, right? Just this idea that understanding a culture is very important if you want to, come in with any kind of intervention. And it's sort of very popular thing to say too, I mean, given all the critique of neocolonialism and so on, right? So yeah, that's a very interesting point. And I think I think the people who are sort of pushing for the international line should jump in here because they have real experience. I mean, I just listened to Adichie.
I totally agree, and I think if you go back and read the World Development Report 2015, so the report says people think automatically, socially, with mental models, and this very much touches on the mental models, especially at the cultural level. Carla Hoff, who was co-author of the report, is publishing a book soon with Joseph Stiglitz on mental models, cultural mental models, and she has a research paper on it, and it's really basically like, how do you better understand where people are coming from, their experiences, their history, to be able to understand how they are viewing the world, to see how can you help them to make better decisions should they choose to. Again, very important to keep that in mind, that we're not trying to change people, cultures, we're not trying to change, we're just helping them have the tools, information, skills to make the decision for themselves. There's also the work of Michelle Gelfand, who talks about loose and tight cultures. It's also very interesting to help you understand how, when can cultures actually change or not, and looking at the social norms and whether they are loose or tight. So that's another area that very interesting research happening right now.
What was the last name of that last author?
Gelfand, Michelle Gelfand, and she's, I think, in California.
Okay,
Berkeley.
Let's move on to the next question, just because we'll try to get both people. I think Gareth, just tell everybody who you are. I think everybody knows who you are, but just tell everybody who you are again.
Okay, no introduction.
No, it is an introduction. I want to know who you are. Who are you?
Okay, I'm Gerd Gigerenzer. I still can remember that. Yeah. Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. And Adam, thanks for putting together this really interesting group of people. I enjoyed this discussion, which I not often say. Luke is right that if we want to have an effect, we might look at the reasons why people do what they do. And Heather made an important point, an honest point, that sending letters and emails to people and thinking about how to design it has had little effect. And as you probably all know, I think we have to face the reality that nudging in this way is highly ineffective. There is a PNAS piece of 2 years or so ago by Meyer et al. That has in the headline, no effect of nudging after correction for publication bias. We should take that seriously and look for alternatives. And I also think if I would start new behavioral policy, I would not start with Thaler and Sunstein's book that has misled us to an individual point of view. All the problems are solved inside. Obesity is sometimes short-term things, not the action of the sugar industry. So how can we do it differently? The German Chancellery has a behavioral policy team that has never done nudging, but trying to increase the competence of people, as we just heard from Liz, by making people strong rather than pushing them. And at the moment, they have been so successful that they are part of the new ministry. And the next job is to make the public officials of the government competent. and many of the problems are structural, they're not individual. So governments and administration and hospitals, for instance, definitive decision making is abundant. Definitive decision making means that decision makers choose not what they think is the best option for the public, or as a doctor, for you as a patient, but the second best that protects them against being blamed. And this is a reason why an organization thinks goes long, people don't want to make decisions and so on. Risk cultures, error cultures, and all these things I think I would encourage you to look less about how to change the individual minds from outside, since we know this is not very effective. But look at the structures. Change the structures, make people competent, and I think then behavioral public policy will be a star event in the sciences.
Does there anybody? I think we can take it almost as a comment.
It's a good comment.
But it sort of squares with this idea of, you know, having a focus on public officials, right? Heather was.
I think it touched on it. If there's any, I should say that if there's any, I think there's some executive MSc students here, and if you get the chance to talk to Gert during the reception, then do so, because Gert is one of the giants in the field, so that would be something that you would remember, I think. As is the guy sitting next to him, Mario Rizzo from NYU, another giant in the field. If I can wake him up, and then I said nice things about you, Mario, so don't worry. You can go back. Okay, next question. At the back, yeah, in the green.
Thank you. My name's Pete from University of Bath. I wondered, in reflecting in the field, what you thought the relationship was with perhaps behavioural public policies, maybe silent cousin, I would call it, of the private sector, because it's struck me in the past 3 days I've heard very little about private sector nudging. And you know, I'm aware that many people in this room might work for private sector companies in different forms. In a previous work, I worked for the company Ogilvy, who have connections with these institutions. I was pleased that Galizzi spoke at the Nudge Stock conference in 2019. So there's clearly overlap, but I wonder what you reflected at the start of behavioural public policies journey, what its relationship is with this private sector approach, which I'll leave open to your interpretation.
Yeah, I think Liz, do you want to comment on that one, Liz?
Sure. So, I mean, I think we're all in this room because we think the toolkit of behavioural public policy is a powerful one, and one that can have an impact at an individual level, but also at a societal level. And I guess that what you're getting at is that that toolkit can be used to positive, good ends, and it can also be used to do harm and for ill. No, that's not what you're getting at. Well, that's what I might talk about.
Not entirely. I mean, we can all think that governments can do good or bad.
Well, that's true.
Subscribe to the view that the toolkit used by government would be good, and we rely on the private sector for a whole range of activities. Indeed, in my sector of transport, we've decided that much of the transport services we use are provided by the private sector, so we're at the behest of how they run it, whether you like that or not.
Yeah, that's right. Well, so, I mean, I think it's the case, you know, it can be used in both ways in lots of different domains. I think I've done a lot of work on online harms, and particularly things like dark patterns and the ways in which behavioural science can be used to manipulate and to trick and deceive people, particularly online. But I think, you know, one of the really interesting things, particularly over the past 5 years, is the growth of behavioural toolkits within private companies as well, whether they be energy companies, water companies, transport providers. And it would be great over time actually to see that sector coming more into these types of forums as well, because I think, just like I said, there's a lot for us to learn from each other internationally. I think there's also interesting lessons to learn across the public-private sector.
Can I say something on that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so when I was at the OES, like, because I'm in marketing, one of the streams of work that I was really excited about was this customer experience. So it's kind of actually on both sides of the political divide in the US. Parties had set this, it doesn't sound very inspiring, but the goal that customer experience with government agencies would be at least the average level of customer experience with the private sector. It's usually worse or much worse. You can think about a lot of different reasons. But one of the interesting things that we saw was like, despite this mandate from the government, I think a lot of people working on these programs had some kind of resistance to doing the kind of things that would make maybe customer experience more positive, because they might feel like, that's marketing, or that's not a good use of our core resources. We're just kind of, I don't know, we should focus on service provision. We shouldn't really worry about customer satisfaction. And I mean, on the one hand, you could say these learnings can go both ways. Like, government could be learning things from the private sector while maybe being making different choices about what to implement with different goals in mind. But there is also this kind of resistance, I think, sometimes in government to taking some of those lessons. Just a comment.
Next question. Annelies, and then we'll go to you. But Annelies, you go first. In the centre, in the middle. Just tell everybody who you are, Annelies.
Hello, I'm Annelies Siboni. I'm a professor of European law at UC Louvain. And since I think the beginning, it's only a handful of lawyers in these conferences, and it's very nice. Don't get me wrong. But I'd be interested in hearing the panel's views on where law and the study of law, legal scholarship, where do you see it fit in the field? Do you see any role for knowledge about the law, to have lawyers in the loop when we design experiments, or whatever else, whatever other connection you see?
If you ask Cass Sunstein whether there's any role for the law in behavioural public.
No, I'm asking you.
Who would like to? Liz, go, and then maybe you can say something, Matteo.
I can take it as a fellow lawyer. So I trained as a lawyer and then worked at the Treasury, so went into economic policy. But I find the legal training very useful, because a lot of the work that I've done has been with regulators around the world, and I think understanding regulation and, you know, from a theoretical and a practical perspective is hugely important, because a lot of the types of interventions that we're designing touch on regulation in some way or another. So I think it's really important, and obviously, you know, some of the giants in the field have that background as well. So.
There's a question.
Can I answer something?
Oh, sorry.
Quickly.
Sorry,
No.
Matteo, yeah.
Just quickly, no. Is follow up on what Liz said. Actually, it's interesting because we are teaching a course on behavioral science for regulation in the executive master in behavioral science. But I think that area is quite interesting. So they apply. So the behavioral inspired regulation, also Faisal and other people mentioned today in the final panel in King's College, is an area where we should probably see more things. So a regulation that is behaviorally inspired and led by evidence, and also easy to use and apply, right? So already in the panel, a lot of people remind the discussion about terms and conditions by companies, which are impossible to navigate, the 25 pages of informed consent form that people clearly don't read or understand. So coming up with expertise from the legal scholar, which are behaviorally open-minded, to get a behavioral scientist, I think have a lot of traction, can have a lot of traction. Yeah.
Is Yuval here?
I think he's gone.
He's gone. Okay. I mean, I wouldn't. I think you're right, Annelies. There could be more lawyers involved in this field, but some of the most prominent people in the field are lawyers, aren't they? And some of the most, some of the people that are most engaged. So obviously there's Cass Sunstein, but Avashalom Tor, who engages himself enormously with what we're doing, is a lawyer. But it's true, I think it is probably true to say that most of their work in the behavioural public policy is not necessarily that law focused, is it really? They start talking about things that the rest of us talk about.
Well, my question was really not about numbers, but about questions and connecting
Can I jump in? Oh, no. Zeina, you go ahead.
So I think lawyers would benefit from behavioral science. So I'll turn it the other way around. Before my behavioral science days, I worked on a pension reform in Iraq, and we worked with the lawyers, and it took 3 days to get the lawyers to be able to distill exactly what the changes mean. What is exactly going to be different in the pension law? What are the, how is it going to affect the people? It took 3 days to get them to finally agree on language, simple enough that all of the beneficiaries would understand. So I would say it'd be great to include behavioral science in law degrees.
We had this discussion just an hour ago or so, which is really sort of centered around consumer protection, right? And the issue of whether you can do price personalization, price differentiation, what the constraints are on that. I mean, that seems to be really a place where the law connects with, the clever schemes behavioral scientists may come up with to do price differentiation. Yeah, but there are constraints on this. Consumer protection constraints. So, that's sort of a field where the two touch, I would say.
Okay, question, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed. I'm the director of the Riyadh Behavioral Insight Center in Saudi Arabia at the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Development and chair of the G20 BI Network. Piggybacking off of your question, what other fields do you guys see as missing that you think could benefit from? And have there been any pushback in your experience in trying to engage those fields to join it? There's a lot, obviously, on systems, sociology. What do you think would further enrich this?
Just start with Matteo. Do you think you can address that, Matteo, a little bit? Could you talk?
What we see is, for instance, from the lens of the application to the behavioral, to the master in executive and master in behavioral science, we see that they're coming, all candidates are coming from many more background and discipline than they came 10 years ago, I would say. So there is a richer interdisciplinarity of the field, as it is clearly evident if you look at the affiliation of the research in the behavioral public policy journal articles, and if you're looking at 24-25 compared to 2018, 2019, typically the submission came from economics, psychology, and that's it. Philosophy, actually, but then now are coming from all the fields, academic disciplines, including behavioral science as an interdisciplinary field in itself. So I think there is clearly a higher interdisciplinary, but the question is...
I mean, I'll address this one very quickly, and then we can go on to another question, I think. I was taught by who I thought at the time were the leading behavioural economists in the UK, some of the leading behavioural economists. So, my PhD supervisors and teachers were Graham Limbs and Bob Sugden, and they're very well known within the behavioural economic field. So I considered myself a behavioural economist, really, I think, in terms of my training. But it struck me quite early on that you cannot limit behavioural public policy to economics and cognitive psychology, which is the main inputs into behavioural economics. So really the development of this field and my involvement in it was to try to encourage people from pretty much all of the social sciences and many of the humanities as well to be involved in behavioural public policy, because it was very clear to me, at least, that lots and lots of those people in those different disciplines, anthropology, management science, sociology, political science, you name it, English literature, right? They were focused upon the study of human behaviour. So I thought that could enrich the field greatly by going beyond, economics obviously and cognitive psychology also obviously are very important, but I thought it could be much further and much deeper. There could be a much deeper enrichment of the field by encouraging all people who are interested in human behaviour to become involved in the field. So I think we're doing that, actually. And I think that is demonstrated by the people that are now engaging themselves in the field. There's a question at the back, yeah. Right at the back, got your hand up. In the middle, put your hand up so she can get the microphone.
Thank you. I'm Flora, I'm BET and also at the Brazilian Institute of Behavioral Science. So a huge deal of the justification of behavioral public policy has been around the preserve of freedom, right? So all the libertarian versus paternalistic spectrum and a lot of the ethical discussion around that. But I wonder if there's another dimension, the one of equity and fairness, and in the sense of maybe mapping situations where there is an asymmetry of power regarding the determinants of behavior and of decision making that are often not that clear or not that they're not that seen if you don't come from that background in that sense. And if that would open the door for other kinds of political narratives or justifications of why your area is relevant, and also of other kinds of applications in that sense. Thanks.
Anybody want to comment on that one, Heather? You look as though you're about to say something. So
I'm not quite sure what I was going to say, but I think, like, to be honest, when I was at the Office of Evaluation Sciences in like 2020, 2021, there was a huge appetite for studying questions related to equity. And some of this was just more on equity of outcomes than equity of access, but saying, for instance, if government funding is going to a certain program, can we use data we're already collecting to see whether it's disproportionately going to some groups rather than others? And so that's, I think, a really cool thing that our field can contribute, because you don't know, right, until you look at this data, and you can then make a more informed decision. It seems that that's a question that the appetite for looking at has changed quite a bit. And I think your question was a little bit more on equity of access, which kind of comes to who's in our field, and maybe like listening to the voices of people saying, you know, what solutions are we looking for? What would we be interested in? And I think that is also something for us to consider when we say who's entering the field, that it is a variety of backgrounds, people who have different experiences, so that we have all these perspectives to consider.
does anybody else want to come in on equity or?
I'm sort of thinking about, you know, there's lots of empirical work being done on, you know, what is it that people conceive as fair? You know, what you have different, you know, the philosophers come up with different conceptions and so on, but what do people conceive as fair? And those kinds of studies, like in the ultimatum game, and, you know, where there's cross-cultural differences in how the ultimatum game is being played and so on. And these kind of empirical studies of these moral dimensions are very informative and are part of behavioral science, I would say, and can be informative for policy making. Yeah.
Mario, take the mic and tell everybody who you are.
Yeah, Mario Rizzo, New York University, an economist. This is an observation. When I first read Nudge, one of the things that I found curious about the book, with one exception, is that new areas were recommended as potential areas for nudging or some sort of behavioral intervention. But they never went back to look at other issues relating to hard interventions. What I'm thinking of specifically is drug laws, the illegal drug laws. They never went back and said, well, maybe, you know, we shouldn't have this war on drugs. It's not successful. It has all these external problems, etc. So why don't we try nudging? You know, legalize the drugs and try then nudge or other behavioral interventions to get people not to take drugs. It seems to me that would be a potential area. The one area, the one exception, was I believe, I don't know if it's in the final edition of Nudge, but in the first edition, there was something about privatization of marriage, something, I forget what they called it, that you would be defaulted into let's say, the traditional marriage contract, but there would also be available to you other possible marriage contracts. So that would be going back to an area where there was a hard, you know, regulation of this is what marriage is, and loosening it up with some default being the normal, traditional marriage or there are other areas of hard regulation that perhaps should be looked at in terms of a weaker form of regulation, but they never did that. And I sort of was always puzzled. Why didn't they do that? I'm not really asking you you know the answer, fine,
Yeah.
but it's more a rhetorical question.
It's something to think about, yeah. Very good.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rupert Gill. I used to head up some behavioural teams in the UK government. I guess I have an observation and then a question. So the observation actually was triggered about this: what do we kind of miss as a behavioural community to try and have impact? And this was triggered by the question about lawyers. I do think the kind of gatekeepers to change in organisations, or even to like everyday decision making. I think to be honest, I think the field fetishises a little bit kind of research and policy. Whereas complex organisations, they're kind of these hidden powers that kind of affect what gets through and what doesn't, right? And that will go from the lawyers who will consider their rationality assumptions, whether people can deal with this themselves, to the finance guys who will say, look, what's the return on investment, do we trust this, to the HR guys who will reward people or not reward people, depending on how adventurous or defensive they are. And all these hidden, if you work in an organisation, lots of our teams like mine will have come across lots of barriers across all sorts of different parts of the organisation. You try and find the people who kind of get it, who are a bit more enlightened about how decision making works. But I don't think as a field we've systematically kind of worked out we need these guys on side if we're going to push through. So I do think that's one area where there's kind of, if you did it again, it'd be great to have more of those people on side and have a real drive into get the lawyers are often the kings, to be honest. They've got the real status, and they're the happiest people in the office because of that status. So I think they're good ones to go for. The question I had actually was more to do with this kind of the boost and can you enhance the decision-making capabilities of would that be a better option, right, rather than changing the context of their decision? Now, I came into this thinking, yeah, I'd love that. I was all into when I was studying philosophy, I was autonomy, decision-making, that's kind of the king of kind of humanity and essential to liberalism. But then when you come into public policy, you realise it's very burdensome and difficult. So how do you increase people's capabilities, right? So you can do heavy-handed things like for driving, you have a driving test, you force people to learn. You've got an education system, obviously. But when it comes to job searching or how to be safe online, they're not easy things to kind of boost people's capabilities. And we know, it's not, people are distracted, they've got limited time, you have limited time to deal with them. So I really like this approach. Could we make people better at dealing with all these risks they come into contact with, or the places where they might make bad decisions? But I find it difficult to see the kind of the easy, those ways in where you can really start to make inroads. So I'd be really interested in reflections from the panel and elsewhere on kind of what you think. How can we unlock that? Right? I think it's a beautiful ideal, but it's really hard to get to.
Anybody want to come in on that?
Shall I do that one?
Yeah, you go.
So I guess the first thing I would say is I think it's a spectrum, and I think there's lots of situations where actually a nudge is a better approach, where actually, if you take pensions, for example, do we need people to have better skills around deciding how much to save for retirement and how to do it? Or do we actually just, it's fairly self-evident in my view that it's a almost universally good thing for people to do at a certain level, and therefore we should auto-enroll people into pensions. So I think there's situations like that where I think actually you don't need a skills and knowledge and capability intervention. Maybe you do at different parts of the journey when people are getting to sort of decumulation and retirement decisions that are much more complex. But I think there's encouraging experimental evidence about boosting and skills and capability. So I guess two more recent ones. So one, the Danish Competition Authority just published an evaluation of the OneSec app, which is trying to encourage people to spend less time on apps on their phone that they decide themselves are the ones that they want to spend less time on. So, there's agency there in the sense of, I'm the one saying I want to spend less time on Instagram, or, I want to spend less time on the FT app or whatever it might be. And then they did this study with young people in Denmark, And the app itself, it sort of sits, I think, on the spectrum between a nudge and a boost, because it has, a fairly classic prompt and friction in it, which is that when you try and go to that app and open Instagram, it will take you through sort of a 10-second breathing exercise so that you can decide if you really want to do it. But I think the interesting thing in the findings from these evaluations is that actually most of the impact you get is because over time people choose not to open Instagram in the first place, not because they're getting the intervention from the 1 Sec app, but because it has changed their thinking about is that really what they want to be doing. So that's just one example, but I do think we are stretching into these areas that are on the boundaries of, yes, you're changing the decision environment, but you're also changing the skills and capabilities at an individual level as well. And I can see the clock and I can see everybody wanting to go and have a drink, so I'm going to stop there.
Well, yes. Okay. I think well, Liz knows that I think that she's much more of a paternalist than I am, but looking down the panel, I think they're all paternalists. I should have got a non-paternalist, but then I wouldn't be able to get an LSE person then. They're all paternalists. I think on that note, we're very close to time, and I think this would be a good opportunity, or a good time to finish for today, wouldn't it? So I just want to finish by saying thank you very much to all of you for coming tonight to this. There were great questions, by the way. There's a reception outside, so please help yourself. Frontier Economics have paid for all the food and drinks, so please, please take advantage of that. Thank you very much to Frontier Economics again. And finally, could we just thank our wonderful panel for their contribution.